In the Brake family kitchen, where the scent of apple pie wafted through the air, Olivia let out a deep sigh as she placed a stack of documents on the table. Across the dining table, her mother Helen was flipping through a glamorous fashion magazine. Her profile was still beautiful, reflecting the confidence of someone who had once been a renowned local beautician. "Hey, Olivia. What do you think of this red dress for Paris?" Helen suddenly held up the magazine to show Olivia. Olivia looked up from her paperwork and forced a tired smile. "It's lovely, Mom." She had no energy to offer more of an opinion. There was a mountain of insurance policy renewal documents that needed to be completed by tomorrow. Her father Charles's insurance agency, Brake Insurance, was well respected locally, but behind that reputation was Olivia's dedicated work. After high school, Olivia had wanted to go to college, but at her father's plea, she began helping with the family business. 16 years had passed since then. "Oh, Lindsay." Helen's voice echoed through the kitchen, and Olivia looked up again. Helen was beaming while looking at her smartphone screen. Her Instagram followers have increased again. "Looks like that recent photo shoot paid off. That girl really has an eye for these things." Olivia responded with a silent smile. Her sister Lindsay had been working in the New York fashion industry for only 3 years, but her flashy lifestyle was already creating buzz on social media. Lindsay was the only one in the family who had been sent to college. "Olivia, when will you finish those documents?" Her father Charles's voice came from the living room. He was known locally as the trusted insurance man. Olivia handled most of the actual work, but Charles was the face of the business. "I'll be done soon, Dad." "Definitely by tomorrow morning," Olivia replied in a tired voice. She had been staying up late recently and wasn't feeling well, but working hard for her family had been her habit since childhood. When Lindsay, then 6 years old, suffered from severe pneumonia, it was Olivia who took care of her instead of their parents. Despite having school, she remembered clearly how she had looked after her sister for a week, barely sleeping. "Oh, Dad. Look." Lindsay burst into the house while they were preparing dinner. Her face was flushed with excitement. Her father looked up from his newspaper. "Tickets to Paris Fashion Week. I finally got them." Lindsay's voice was pitched with excitement. Since she was little, she had dreamed of attending Paris fashion shows. "Congratulations, Lindsay." Her mother jumped up with joy and rushed to Lindsay. Her father also had a broad smile on his face. "Actually, I have 3 tickets. One for me, and one's for Dad and Mom too." The living room erupted with cheers at Lindsay's words. Olivia watched her family's joy from the kitchen and smiled. "I wish I could go too," Olivia whispered softly. For Olivia, who had never been to Europe, Paris was a dream destination. Did you say something?" Her mother turned around. "I wish I could go too," Olivia said shyly. For a moment, the room fell silent. "But, Olivia, someone needs to look after the company, right?" Her father's words were kind but resolute. "That's right. It's an important time for policy renewals. Dad's company can't function without you," her mother added, and Lindsay nodded in agreement. "Besides, there are only 3 tickets." "Sorry, Olivia," Lindsay's voice held no genuine regret. Olivia tried to maintain her smile. "I understand. It's okay. Have a good time." That night, with just 2 days until departure, the family dinner was filled with talk of Paris. Olivia ate quietly, gradually feeling her headache and sore throat getting worse. She seemed to have caught a cold. However, telling her family would only ruin their happy mood before the trip. Olivia silently took some pain medication and went to bed early. The next day, Olivia was suffering from a high fever from the morning. Still, she went to work and processed the remaining documents. By evening, she had been so dizzy she could barely stand. When she returned home, her family was in a frenzy preparing for the trip. "Olivia, what do you think of this dress?" Lindsay asked, holding up a glamorous dress. Although Olivia's vision was blurred from her headache, she managed a smile. It's beautiful. She had no energy to say more. There was a mountain of insurance policy renewal documents that had to be completed by tomorrow. Great. Thanks. Oh, and please take care of these important company documents. I need to send them to a client from Paris, Lindsay said while pushing a stack of papers into Olivia's hands. Olivia nodded but swayed, leaning against the wall for support. What's wrong? Her mother asked with momentary concern. Just a cold, I think, Olivia answered weakly. Oh dear, that's too bad. But you'll feel better tomorrow. Have some herbal tea, her mother said before returning to her packing. Olivia quietly headed to her room without anyone noticing. Her body felt burning hot, and she had severe chills. Although she sensed something was seriously wrong, she crawled into bed, not wanting to worry her family. The day before the trip, Olivia's condition continued to worsen. With a fever, her chest hurt with every breath. Nevertheless, she checked the final documents for her father's company and prepared the necessary materials as Lindsay had instructed. No one in the family noticed Olivia's serious condition. Or perhaps they were pretending not to notice. Watching her family immersed in the joy of their upcoming travel, Olivia painfully realized for the first time how much she was taken for granted in this family. On the morning of the trip, Olivia struggled to get out of bed. Her head pounded as if struck by a hammer, and her body felt as heavy as lead. As soon as she left her bed, her vision darkened with dizziness, and she had to lean against the wall for support. It's hard to breathe. Feeling a sharp pain in her lungs, Olivia made her way into the hallway. From downstairs, she could hear the cheerful voices of her family. The sound of suitcases rolling, laughter, and the electronic sound of photos being taken. Olivia slowly descended the stairs, holding onto the railing. Mom. Olivia's voice was hoarse and weak as she stood in the living room. Helen, who was checking a pastel blue suitcase, turned around. Oh, you're up? You don't look well, Helen's voice reflected impatience more than concern. Looking at the clock, it was almost time to leave. Please, take me to the hospital, Olivia said, leaning against the wall with trembling hands. Sweat dripped down her cheeks from her forehead. Lindsay came down the stairs with her smartphone in hand and saw Olivia. Are you okay? Don't tell me it's the flu. There was clear disgust in Lindsay's voice. She took a step back and put on a mask from her pocket. My fever is high, can't breathe. Olivia's words came out in fragments. Charles poked his head in from the entrance. The taxi's here. We need to hurry or we'll miss the plane. Charles didn't immediately notice his daughter's condition. When he finally realized something was wrong, he looked confused. Olivia, are you okay? Dad, hospital, please. Olivia stumbled and reached out to her father. Charles took a step toward his daughter, but then the taxi's horn sounded from outside. Charles, it's time. Helen called out anxiously. She glanced at Olivia before gripping her suitcase handle tightly. We're about to leave for France. It's impossible. Deal with it yourself. With those words, a cold smile appeared on Helen's lips. It was like a defensive instinct, a smile to justify a mother abandoning her child. But Olivia's body suddenly collapsed, and she fell to the floor on her knees. Lindsay watched this and sighed with irritation. Don't ruin our trip.
Bye.
Lindsay said as she pulled her suitcase toward the entrance. Charles looked torn between his daughter and wife, his expression confused. Olivia, there's medicine in the box on top of the refrigerator. I'll take you to the doctor when we get back. With those words, Charles also left the house. Olivia watched the closing front door in disbelief. The cheerful voices of the three family members and the sound of the departing taxi's engine faded away. Help me. Olivia's voice, lying on the living room floor, reached no one. She spotted her cell phone on the table, but it was out of reach. Every attempt to move sent sharp pain through her chest. Even breathing was difficult. Olivia curled up on the floor, feeling her consciousness slipping away as she trembled. The room fell silent, with only the second hand of the clock ticking coldly. Olivia's breathing became rough and irregular. The light coming in from outside hurt her eyes, and her head felt like it was exploding. Jessica. The name of her longtime friend escaped faintly from her lips. She had plans to meet Jessica this weekend. If only she would come. But that was still 2 days away. Just before losing consciousness, Olivia thought of her family's faces. The days when she had nursed a feverish Lindsay as a child. The surprise cake she had secretly made for her mother's birthday. The nights she had stayed up helping when her father's company was in crisis. Why? With those words, Olivia's consciousness sank completely into darkness. Her body, lying on the living room floor, shook with fever. The light coming through the window moved, and the shadows grew longer. In the empty house, only time passed mercilessly. 2 days later, in the afternoon, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the silent house. After a while, there was the sound of a key turning. Olivia? Are you here? We had plans, but I was worried when you didn't answer your phone. Jessica's voice came from the entrance. As she moved down the hallway and opened the living room door, she found Olivia still lying on the floor. Olivia! Jessica screamed and rushed to her friend. Olivia's skin was abnormally hot, and her breathing was shallow and irregular. Hang in there. I'm calling an ambulance. Olivia's consciousness was far away. Jessica's voice, the ambulance siren, the sensation of being placed on a hospital stretcher, all remained only as distant, blurred memories, as if heard underwater. Looking up at the white ceiling of the hospital, Olivia was slowly regaining consciousness. An N4 line was connected to her arm, and an oxygen mask covered her face. Someone was talking quietly in the corner of the room. At first, she couldn't understand who was speaking. There's a risk of fluid accumulating in her lungs if this continues. Let's continue the antibiotics and monitor her condition. It was a doctor's voice. The female voice that responded was Jessica's. Olivia tried to open her eyes, but her eyelids were heavy and wouldn't move as she wanted. Olivia? Jessica noticed and came closer. Relief spread across her face. Thank goodness you're awake. You're going to be okay, now. Olivia tried to say something, but her throat burned painfully, and only a hoarse voice came out. My family. At those words, Jessica's expression clouded. They're still in France. I've been in contact with them, but... Jessica hesitated. Olivia could sense her friend's anger. Actually, I posted about you on social media. I'm sorry. But I thought what they did was too cruel. Olivia weakly shook her head. She didn't fully understand what was so cruel yet. She only remembered that her family had left her behind to go on their trip. That cold smile, Lindsay's words, don't ruin our trip. What kind of post? Olivia's voice was faint. Jessica hesitantly took out her smartphone and showed her the screen. The post included a photo of Olivia in a hospital bed wearing an oxygen mask. Hundreds of comments were lined up in the comment section. I'm sorry, Olivia. But I thought everyone should know. There were tears in Jessica's eyes. Olivia squeezed her friend's hand and nodded slightly. She felt more tired and sad than angry. Everyone in town is angry, Jessica said. Olivia closed her eyes at her friend's words. It was painful to think about her family. What were they doing in Paris right now? Were they worried about her at all? The door to the hospital room opened, and a woman entered. Her silver hair was neatly arranged in a chignon, exuding an old-fashioned elegance. Olivia. It was her grandmother, Elizabeth. She hurried to the bedside and took her granddaughter's hand. Jessica contacted me, and I got on a plane right away. I was so worried about you. There were tears shining in Elizabeth's eyes. Olivia felt her own tears welling up at her grandmother's kindness. Grandma, thank you. Elizabeth placed her hand on Olivia's forehead and gently stroked her hair. I tried calling Helen many times, but couldn't get through. That girl, leaving her daughter in this condition. There was a mixture of anger and sadness in Elizabeth's voice. She had also seen Jessica's post. Helen had a difficult childhood, Elizabeth said, sitting down beside Olivia's bed and beginning to speak quietly. When she was small, we were struggling financially, and I was working 2 jobs. I couldn't give her enough love and attention. She was always alone and felt lonely. Regret showed in Elizabeth's eyes. But that's no excuse for your mother to treat you this way. If anything, having experienced loneliness herself should have made her determined not to let her daughter feel the same way. Elizabeth let out a deep sigh. Listening to her grandmother's story, Olivia felt she could understand a little bit about the background of her mother's coldness. But still, what happened this time was unforgivable. The TV in the hospital room was on at a low volume. A local news program was playing, and the announcer's voice could be heard. Shocking news has spread about the president of local insurance agency, Break Insurance, and his family departing for a Paris trip, leaving behind their seriously ill daughter. This story, which began with a social media post, has drawn criticism from many citizens. Olivia was surprised to see the screen. The story had become such a big topic that it was even being covered in local news. We have information that multiple customers have requested to cancel their contracts following this news. Elizabeth turned off the TV with the remote. Don't worry about it. Your recovery is the most important thing right now. Olivia could only nod. Thinking about the impact on her father's company made her chest hurt. Even after being hurt so deeply, she couldn't help but wish for her family's happiness. Jessica's post spread rapidly, being picked up not only by the local community but also by national news sites. It sparked discussions on what family bonds truly mean, and the Break family became the subject of a moral lesson. In Paris, notifications began flooding Lindsay's smartphone. At first, she thought they were messages from friends, but she soon realized that comments of condemnation were pouring in from strangers. Mom, something terrible is happening, Lindsay showed her smartphone to her mother with trembling hands at a cafe after a fashion show. The color drained from Helen's face. Charles also peered at the screen and looked dismayed. Olivia is hospitalized? Charles's voice was shaking. He hurriedly took out his smartphone and called the office. The answering machine at the office had several messages from angry customers canceling their contracts. We need to go back immediately. Charles decided, and Helen and Lindsay nodded. Their faces showed fear and guilt. A few hours later, the 3 had canceled their Paris tickets and purchased new ones at a high price for a return flight to America. At the hospital, Olivia's condition was slowly beginning to improve. Grandmother Elizabeth never left her side, and Jessica also visited frequently. Surrounded by their love, Olivia felt cherished for the first time in a long while. Olivia, you are a wonderful person, Elizabeth said quietly while knitting by the bedside. Your kindness and patience should have been appreciated more. But things will be different now. Live your life for yourself. Olivia's eyes welled up at her grandmother's words. She felt as if her value, after years of devotion to her family, was finally being recognized. Hurried footsteps echoed in the hospital corridor. Charles, Helen, and Lindsay were heading toward the nurse's station with tired expressions. Their complexions were poor from jet lag and panic, especially Helen, who was visibly distraught. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, was disheveled, and her makeup was fading. Which room is Olivia Break in? We're her family, Charles asked the receptionist nurse. His voice was trembling, unlike his usual confident tone. The nurse looked up at the 3 and seemed to hesitate for a moment. Room 304. But she has visitors at the moment. The 3 hurried in the indicated direction. Upon reaching the door, Charles took a deep breath and knocked. There was no response, but he slowly opened the door. The hospital room was quiet. Olivia lay in the bed by the window, wearing an oxygen mask. Beside her sat Elizabeth with a solemn expression, holding Olivia's hand. Elizabeth's eyes turned cold as ice when she saw the 3 enter the room. So you've finally come, Elizabeth's voice was filled with anger. Olivia opened her eyes and looked at her family. Her expression revealed nothing. "Mother, we came back as soon as we heard that Olivia was in serious condition," Helen said as if making an excuse. Elizabeth stood up and confronted her daughter. "Immediately? Because of your delayed return from Paris, Olivia has been in the hospital for 4 days now. You shouldn't have left in the first place, seeing her condition." Elizabeth's voice was low but trembling with barely contained anger. Charles bowed his head and tried to approach Olivia's bed. "Stay away," Elizabeth raised her hand to stop him. "Do you three truly understand what you've done?" A heavy silence filled the room. Lindsay stood by the wall, looking like she was about to cry. "Mother-in-law, Charles tried to say something, but Elizabeth continued. "Olivia had severe pneumonia and nearly lost her life. If Jessica hadn't come to visit, you would have returned from Paris to face your daughter's body." At those words, Helen collapsed into a chair, her face pale. Lindsay leaned against the wall and began sobbing. Only Charles remained standing, staring at Olivia. "Olivia, I'm truly sorry." His voice broke off. Olivia said nothing, just staring at the ceiling. "Our company," Charles faltered. Olivia's gaze slowly turned to her father. "We've lost many customers. Everyone is canceling their contracts. You said the company wouldn't function without you, but now there may not be a company at all." There was despair in Charles's voice. He had completely lost the trust of the community overnight. "Lindsay too," Helen said in a small voice. "All her fashion-related work has been cancelled. Her social media followers have plummeted, and there's nothing but criticism." Lindsay covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she cried. "But you brought this upon yourselves," Elizabeth said calmly. "You don't understand how much Olivia has done for the family." Elizabeth walked over to Olivia's bed and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you remember when Lindsay had severe pneumonia when she was 13? Helen and Charles looked at each other. Olivia, who was 16 at the time, nursed 6-year-old Lindsay for a week without sleep. Despite having school. The hospital room fell silent at Elizabeth's words. Olivia's teacher called to say she had been absent. When I came home, Olivia was by Lindsay's bedside, nursing her. She was giving water to her sister who was delirious with fever, trying to lower her temperature with cold towels." Lindsay looked up, staring at Olivia with a surprised expression. "I didn't know that." "Of course not. You were still a small child. But your parents? Why did they put all the burden on Olivia?" Elizabeth's eyes were stern, fixing on Helen and Charles. "And now, you abandoned your daughter to go on a trip. With pneumonia for the second time, now Olivia herself is suffering." Lindsay's crying echoed in the room. She approached the bed and tried to take Olivia's hand. "Olivia, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Her voice trembled with tears. Olivia slowly looked at her sister. In her eyes was deep sadness rather than anger. "I just wanted to be valued as a member of the family." Olivia's voice was hoarse, but it reached everyone in the room. "I didn't want special treatment. I just wanted to be respected as a person." At those words, Lindsay took Olivia's hand and pressed it to her forehead, crying intensely. "I didn't understand. I didn't understand at all how much you've done for us." Charles approached the other side of his daughter's bed and knelt. "Olivia, I've completely failed as a father. I took your dedication for granted. I won't ask for forgiveness. It's not something that can be forgiven." Tears welled in his eyes. For the first time, vulnerability showed on the face of a man who had remained strong for years. Helen stood up from her chair and stood beside her husband and daughter. Her face showed emotions she had hidden for years. "I might have been jealous of you," Helen said in a small voice. "Everyone liked you and relied on you. You had what I couldn't have when I was young. So sometimes, I became mean." Olivia looked surprised at her mother's confession. It was the first time Helen had spoken honestly about her feelings. "But abandoning you can't be excused by anything. As a mother, as a human being, it was the worst thing I could have done." Helen's voice broke, and she covered her face with both hands. Lindsay put her arm around her mother's shoulders, and the three gathered around Olivia's bed. Elizabeth watched the scene from a distance. Her stern expression had softened slightly. For the first time, she felt there were signs of change in this family. "Olivia," Elizabeth called quietly. "Whether to forgive them is up to you. But remember, forgiveness means acknowledging what happened in the past, not forgetting it." Olivia nodded slowly. In her heart, there was still anger and sadness. However, seeing her family's genuine remorse, a small hope was beginning to form. 6 months later, in the deepening autumn twilight, Olivia stood at the front door of her grandmother Elizabeth's house, collecting the mail. After her recovery, she had decided to live with Elizabeth, spending peaceful days in a small house. "Any interesting letters?" Elizabeth's voice came from the living room. Olivia entered the house, holding a bundle of envelopes. "Just bills and advertisements," Olivia smiled and sat down on the sofa next to her grandmother. Her recovery from illness was going well, and her health had improved. The wounds in her heart were healing little by little, though they would never completely disappear. Her father Charles's insurance agency had to downsize significantly after the incident. More than half of the customers had terminated their contracts, and it would take time to rebuild trust in the community. Now he was operating from a small office, continuing the business alone. After the incident, he had greatly changed his business policy, focusing on honest management that put customers first. Every Sunday, he would visit Olivia without fail, sometimes consulting her about work. His expression no longer showed the confident demeanor of before, instead, humility had grown in its place. Lindsay had left the fashion industry and begun working as a volunteer at a local youth support center. Reflecting on her past actions, she was passionate about caring for underprivileged young people. She especially focused on supporting teenagers struggling with family relationships. Every Wednesday, she would have lunch with Olivia, gradually trying to rebuild the broken bond between sisters. "Lindsay called," Elizabeth said while knitting. "She wants to talk to you about Christmas plans." Olivia nodded slightly. Christmas was still 2 months away, but it would be the first time the whole family would spend it together since the incident. Helen had undergone the most significant change. She regularly attended psychological counseling, confronting the problems in her parenting. She gained a deeper understanding of the lack of affection she had received and its impact on her children. It took courage for her to acknowledge her envy toward Olivia and the distorted attitude it had created. Recently, she had joined a local women's support group, sharing experiences with other mothers facing similar issues. The relationship restoration between Olivia and Helen took longer than with the rest of the family. Mother and daughter would meet once a month in a neutral place, gradually building conversation over tea. Sometimes there would be silence, but both were making efforts to repair their relationship. Elizabeth's phone rang, and she put down her knitting to answer it. After a brief conversation, she turned back to Olivia. "It's your father. He wants to stop by after work today." Olivia nodded, gazing out the window. Complex emotions still swirled within her. Complete forgiveness would take time. However, seeing her family sincerely repent and try to change, she was gradually opening her heart. That night, Charles arrived with a small package. It was an old wristwatch that had belonged to Olivia's maternal grandfather. "This should have been given to you, as the eldest daughter," Charles said quietly. Regret showed in his eyes. "We should have recognized your value much earlier." Olivia quietly accepted the watch and looked at the words engraved on its back, "Time reveals truth." She smiled slightly. On Christmas Eve, the entire family gathered at Olivia and Elizabeth's house. Homemade dishes were arranged on the table, and a fire was lit in the fireplace. Each brought small presents and letters expressing gratitude to Olivia. After reading the letters, quiet tears shone in Olivia's eyes. She had not yet completely forgiven the past, but she found hope in this new version of her family. She felt that her grandmother Elizabeth's wisdom and love were slowly but surely repairing the bonds of the family that had nearly fallen apart. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall quietly, as if bringing the sense of a new year and a new beginning.